The word cortex means bark, not bark like a dog, but bark like on a tree. The cortex is the outer chocolate candy shell of the brain, or the outer covering of gray matter, unmyelinated neurons. The hills are called gyri, or gyrus for the singular version. The valleys are called sulci, or sulcus for the singular version. These gyri, each one of them does something very specific, and we can name them according to their location, which doesn't help, right? We can also name them according to their function, and that does help. And of course, in this class, we're going to do both. But gyri and sulci, what they do is they expand the surface area of the brain. They create a large surface area over which we can have this cortex. And even though it's a thin layer or bark, it is quite effective in generating output from the central nervous system. There is a sulcus that divides the brain into front or back, or rostral and caudal sections. And this is aptly named the central sulcus. The gyrus, that is rostral or in front of the central sulcus, is called the precentral gyrus. Guess what the gyrus behind or caudal to the central sulcus is called? You guessed it, the post-central gyrus. These are locational names, right? Precentral and post-central. But what do these gyri do? Like, what's their functional name? So the precentral gyrus houses what's called the primary motor cortex. And this is the last stop for outgoing information to your skeletal muscles. After all sensory information has been gathered, after all patterns of movement have been determined, and after everything is ready to descend the spinal cord, it all stops at this primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex doesn't determine anything. It doesn't decide movements that you make. It makes no decisions other than where to send the information. The sciatic nerve, the brachial nerve. The primary motor cortex is attached to the cortico-spinal pathway. That was the motor or descending pathway that transmits voluntary information to your skeletal muscles. It's this cortex that can also be referred to as the primary somatomotor cortex, since it controls muscle. Look at this lateral view of the brain up here with the primary motor cortex colored in green on a sagittal cut and the lateral view. It's kind of like a headband, right? Now look at the picture on the bottom, which is a coronal section, and I want you to take a look at the funny looking person on it. This is how your motor cortex sees your body. There are lots of muscles to control the face and the hands, and that is what makes the very fine, very precise movements. Arms and legs, not so precise. The limbs have very large scale, coarse movements compared to the face and the hands. And that's why this little man here has really small arms and really small legs. This little man is called a homunculus. And this one here is the motor homunculus. It is how your primary motor cortex sees or perceives the muscles of your body. Before any type of information even goes to the primary motor cortex, it's spent a little time in the cortex called the premotor cortex. And the premotor cortex is in the pre-central gyrus. No, I'm kidding. That's not what it's called. This here is the central sulcus, and I'm going to label that central sulcus. And this gyrus right here is the primary motor gyrus. And then I'm also going to label in blue this one right here, which is the premotor gyrus. And the premotor gyrus is in the frontal lobe. The premotor cortex consolidates info from different parts of the brain. It's going to take information from the cerebellum regarding your balance. It's going to take information from your occipital lobe about how far away that curb is when you're trying to cross the street. And it's going to take in any other information to consolidate it and determine an output. It's this part of your brain that prevents you from tying your shoes as a child. Kidding. Well, actually, not kidding. It is. You have to kind of practice tying your shoes to train this part of your brain to learn the pattern. Once the premotor cortex develops a little bit more as a child, you can grasp the meaning of the sequence of movements needed to tie your shoes, use the bathroom, and anything other patterned. Playing an instrument, knitting, hitting a baseball, and tons of other patterned movements are consolidated here. In the previous two slides, we saw how information leaves the brain, the cerebrum, by stopping at the premotor cortex and then at the primary motor cortex. Well, caudal, or posterior to the central sulcus, is the post-central gyrus that I mentioned earlier. And this post-central gyrus houses the primary somatosensory cortex. Don't be intimidated by the name. This is the cortex that would receive any incoming information from somatic tissues, right? Somatosensory. So this would receive incoming information from skeletal muscles, skin, bones, but no squishy organs. So this cortex receives info about external temperature, pain, touch, other general senses, most of them taken in by free nerve endings. It's a lot of different types of info. And just like the little man, the homunculus, for how your brain sees your muscles, there's also a homunculus for sensory input. Again, your face and your hands are prioritized, so you can be very discreet as to where sensations are on those. When some dust particle lands on your eyelid, you can tell if it's on the inside, the middle, of the outside of the eyelid. But with your back and your legs, you have these really large overlapping receptor fields that make it like impossible to tell if somebody's touching you here or here on your back, right? And that's what produces the scratches down, no, to the left, more to the left, no, down, right? And you keep activating receptor fields. Information incoming to the primary somatosensory cortex is coming from peripheral tissues, and it's ascending, most of it, up the spinothalamic tract. The thalamus, which I don't know if I agree with this name, but the thalamus is called the gateway to your cerebrum. But your thalamus is what determines exactly where in the sensory cortex information should go, and it sends it there. Remember that there is usually a unipolar sensory neuron taking in sensory information. Then another neuron brings that information up the spinal tract, and then another neuron, which is a neuron of the third order, that brings information from the thalamus that's right here, and it sends it to the right place in the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so the primary sensory cortex says your skin is hot. The somatosensory association area says it's hot, I'm wearing a sweater, and I'm standing in the sun. It's this area, the somatosensory association cortex, that generates perception, right? It takes sensation and it provides meaning to it, perception. So just like that premotor cortex, this somatosensory cortex is located in the gyrus that is posterior to the post-central gyrus. You're like, Amy, that makes no sense. So this is our central sulcus right here. Here's our central sulcus. Here is our post-central gyrus, and the somatosensory association areas are right there. Again, here is our post-central gyrus, and the somatosensory association areas are pretty much right there. Okay, so I want to draw an abridged circuit for you just bear with me for a moment with this. Info comes into the primary somatosensory cortex from the spinothalamic tract, right? So information comes into the thalamus, then a neuron brings it into this area, and then another neuron brings it over here. And actually, there can be a couple neurons bringing the information over to the somatosensory association area. So this information, honestly, it probably pings around a little bit, picking up other information into a circuit, and then all of that information goes to the premotor cortex, and the premotor cortex sends it to the primary motor cortex. And then the primary motor cortex actually sends it down the corticospinal pathway. So I know that's a terrible circuit, but it does show you how information comes in, pings around, gets planned, and then goes out. And what this would result in is you either taking off or going to get a sweater.